This is Nasha Kasha, a Ukrainian almanac, 28 minutes of stories for everyone about Ukrainian life. Nasha Kasha is heard on 16 campus and community radio stations from Newfoundland to British Columbia. Today's story is about borders. You'll hear from two ambassadors, Ukraine's ambassador to Canada, and just having completed 5 years of service, career diplomat, Canada's former ambassador to Ukraine. Defining borders, bridging understanding across borders. Вітаю! My name is Stefan Andrusiak. Recorded in Ottawa, this is episode 183. Canada is among the strongest international supporters of Ukraine's efforts to restore stability and implement democratic economic reforms. So reads Global Affairs Canada's webpage, November 28, 2019. It goes on to say, quote, "Together with our allies and partners, we continue to call on Russia to follow through on its Geneva commitments to de-escalate the crisis and call off its provocateurs. Canada has taken a number of steps to support the Ukrainian people as they work to restore political and economic stability, including imposing sanctions against those responsible for the ongoing crisis. Canada has also taken steps to enhance the readiness of NATO through a number of reassurance measures to reinforce the alliance's collective defense. Until Russia clearly demonstrates its respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, Canada will continue to work with its allies and like-minded countries to apply pressure that will further isolate Russia economically and politically." End of quote. Here's Victor Vinnik and Mary. Mary is short for Meridian, and he sings Наш кордон, Our Border.
На переднім рубежі все не так. На переднім рубежі земля глуха від атак. На переднім рубежі навіть тиша страшна. На переднім рубежі війна. Ти вслухаєшся у кожен тихий звук. Може постріл, ну а може просто серця стук. І вдивляєшся в далекий горизонт. Там передній край, там наш кордон, як лінія долі. Кордон, за ним стільки болю. Кордон, по серцю проліг. Кордон, ти втримав, ти зміг свій кордон. Свій кордон. Свій кордон. Наш кордон.
Кордон, border. Край also means edge or border. Країна means homeland. Ukraina, Ukraine, is both. A homeland fighting to maintain its eastern border and the homelands within those borders. Crimea had been internationally recognized as part of Ukraine when it was invaded, occupied, claimed by Russia. This was in February and March of 2014. And Russia annexed Crimea. In Donbass, Russian-backed separatist forces continue to destabilize eastern Ukraine today. It's estimated that 7% of Ukraine is under Russian occupation. About 5 years ago, it is into this troubled land that Canada sent Ambassador Roman Vashchuk with his wife Oksana. Both had grown up in the Scouting movement, albeit at opposite ends of the Commonwealth. We'll hear from them later. Coming the other way, Ukraine dispatched its ambassador Andriy Shevchenko. Shevchenko is a former journalist. He had reported from the Maidan, Kyiv's central square, during the people's uprising against now disgraced former president Viktor Yanukovych. Now, half a decade later, on November 1st, 2019, they were both in Ottawa, The Ukrainian-Canadian Congress invited Vashchuk and Shevchenko to address delegates at its triennial convention. Roman Vashchuk had just concluded his diplomatic posting to Ukraine. He had flown to Ottawa from Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Larisa Galadze is his replacement in Ukraine. She had been Director General of the Peace and Stabilization Operations Program at Global Affairs Canada. These skills will come in handy, to be sure. But on this day, it was Vashchuk and Shevchenko who were in the spotlight for their past collaboration. Ukraine's ambassador began his assessment of Ukraine's engagement with Canada with a tribute to his former Canadian counterpart.
Roman has become a de facto leader of the diplomatic corps in Kyiv. Canada has so many reasons to be proud of his work in Ukraine. And on a personal note, I can add that it was a real privilege and a blessing for me to work with Roman. I felt we had a very special connection. Sometimes we wouldn't speak for weeks, yet we would always be on the same page on every major issue between our two countries. At some point, I said that I felt Roman was my ambassadorial twin brother. And that's pretty much the feeling I still have. And now I would like to share some things that we worked together on. And a couple of weeks ago, or actually a couple of months ago, when the new Ukrainian cabinet was installed, I decided to make a series of phone calls to the new appointed ministers to make sure they are well briefed on the Ukrainian-Canadian relationship. And I should confess that it took a lot of conference call time actually to make sure that the new cabinet knows how many things are happening between us. And when I shared some of that with a friend of mine who is a senior official in the Canadian government, I was told, Andriy, you should put this into one big picture. And I said, well, there's too much stuff to be put in one picture, but I think we can start, we can give it a try. And so we did. In general, I can say that we are really on a way to build a very strong, very fruitful, and very rich and sustainable relationship between our countries. Whether it's defense and security, or trade, or education and culture, we see that this relationship is very complex, very interconnected. Second, this relationship is mutually beneficial. It means common interest. It means satisfying different interests of each of us. And I'll try to give you a couple of examples of that. Let's say if we choose the field of defense and security, we both benefit from Operation Unifier, which is a military training mission in Ukraine. Yes, Ukrainians learn a lot from Canadians, but it's very much a two-way learning process, two-way street learning process. Together with Roman, we had a chance to accompany Prime Minister Trudeau during his trip to Yavoriv. And I remember how the Vendus stationed in Yavoriv shared what they had learned from their Ukrainian friends, colleagues, and comrades. Whether it's a trench war or electronic and radio warfare, we know that Ukrainian armed forces possess unique knowledge, unique experience, and we're happy to share this knowledge of how to fight the Russians in the east of Ukraine. This knowledge comes with a very high price, and we are ready to share it with our NATO friends. We want to make sure that every Canadian soldier and officer, every Canadian operative in Latvia or in Romania or here on Canadian soil is well equipped with all the knowledge that we have, and he or she is well prepared how to deal with the Russians and how to make sure that they can fulfill their duties in the best and most efficient way. The same goes for trade. We launched Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement, and we do expect Ukrainian businesses to greatly benefit from this new market, which is now open to them. And also, we are very happy to see Canadian businesses benefiting from this cooperation. Many of you might be surprised to learn that Ukraine is #4 buyer of Canadian fish and seafood. Big Canadian companies outsource their software production to Ukrainian IT companies and IT freelancers. And we also have some very meaningful first pioneer Canadian investments on the Ukrainian soil. Refraction management from Alberta works in the field of sustainable energy. Fairfax in the financial sector. We hope to see some developments with black iron in the home city of the new President Zelensky, Kryvyi Rih. And there are so many other things yet to come. Thirdly, I think there is something which is very important to discuss here in this audience. There is something very universal, no matter which branch or which direction you go. And it is about the essential role of the Ukrainian-Canadian community in this relationship. No matter what we talk about, education, humanitarian aid, business and investment, Hromada plays a major role. Ukrainian-Canadian organizations play a major role, and prominent representatives of the Ukrainian-Canadian community are very essential to that. So when we see the big picture, we also can notice some fields where still a lot of work is to be done, and I would identify one of those. It's visa-free regime between Ukraine and Canada. I should acknowledge that under leadership of Roman, Canadian Embassy has improved the procedures for Ukrainians who apply for Canadian visas. Now we have a very good processing time. Most of the time it's 5 to 8 days, which is very good for Canadian standards. Visas for Ukrainians are also issued for the time up to 10 years, which is also very good and very convenient. And this is something to be much appreciated. But at the same time, there is no good and fair explanation why the refusal rate for Ukrainian citizens is still around 26%. And I should admit that this is higher than for countries like Russia or China. And we feel we together can do so much better in facilitation those people-to-people ties between our countries that we praise so high. But again, even here, it's not a broken branch of this tree. We see a way forward. We are very grateful to the Trudeau government for offering us to join the Trusted Travelers Program, or ETA Plus, how we call it. It's something that Canada has with Brazil. And we're looking forward to following up on this with the new cabinet here in Canada when it is installed. We're also very excited about the Youth Mobility Agreement that we hope to sign maybe next year or in the next several months to come. When Canadians ask me why Canada needs to focus on Ukraine, I say because this is key to your global influence. If you want to understand how the world operates in the 21st century, work with Ukraine. If you need partners in advancing Canadian values, if you are serious about that, free trade, multilateralism, respect for international rules, for international law, work with Ukraine. If you want to be an influencer on the world stage, again, work with Ukraine. I think this shows how good partners can address big issues together with respect, with patience, and it tells us how we should proceed together ahead.
Nasha Kasha comes to you from CHRW 94.9 FM on the campus of Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. We're heard on CHMR 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland, on CKDU 88.1 FM in Halifax, on local 107.3 FM in St. John, New Brunswick, on CJAS Radio 93.5 FM in Saint Augustine, Quebec, on CJLO 1690 AM in Montreal, on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, on CFMU 93.3 FM in Hamilton, on CKMS 102.7 FM in Kitchener-Waterloo, on CJAM 99.1 FM in Windsor and Detroit, on CKLU 96.7 FM in Sudbury, on CILU 102.7 FM in Thunder Bay, on 101.5 UMFM in Winnipeg, on CFMQ 98.1 FM in Hudson Bay, Saskatchewan, on CFBX 92.5 FM in Kamloops, and on CIVL 101.7 FM in Abbotsford, British Columbia.
Hi, my name is Oksana Smerachuk. Born in Australia, most of my adult life, is now in Canada, and most recently I've been living in Ukraine.
Roman Vashchuk. I'm originally from Toronto and have been in the Canadian Foreign Service for over 30 years.
Your parents emigrated to Australia after the Second World War or before that?
Well, that's right. My parents ended up in Sydney, in Australia, and came as working immigrants. And I grew up very much as sort of a insular experience in Australia, where the community was relatively small in comparison to the outside Australian community, and also rather isolated, I think, from Europe, from North America and the wider Ukrainian diaspora.
Australia, was it at the time of your parents' arrival, was it welcoming?
I think that influx of immigrants right after the Second World War, I think, served to change the nature of Australia. And I think Australians were welcoming in the sense of coming from a Anglo culture. There is a tendency to welcome newcomers and make an effort to include them. Still, I think there is more of a homogenous culture there.
Brothers, sisters?
I have one sister, still in Australia, a lawyer.
Mr. Ambassador, how did your ancestors find their way to Canada?
After World War II, through the displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria, so arriving between 1948 and early 1950. Interestingly, first, my father's family was sponsored to Redwater, Alberta. They lasted one winter in Redwater and decided they were kind of more like city people and got on a train to Toronto. My mother's family came originally to Kitchener, and within a year they were in Toronto as well. So this Toronto syndrome set in with both families.
You have brothers, sisters?
I've got a brother. We were part of St. Nicholas Ukrainian Catholic Church on Queen West in the now trendy Trinity Bellwoods neighborhood, which was not half as trendy back then. I was a member of Plast. I went to Ukrainian evening, later Saturday school.
Now, Plast is the scouting organization.
That's right. I never danced because I am not coordinated enough to engage in Ukrainian dance. So that's the one stereotypical thing I managed not to do in my youth.
So it wasn't his dancing that caught your attention. How did you meet?
I think his speaking skills. I think we really got to know each other when we were together at a Plast camp and we were writing the camp newspaper together. I think it was his, sense of humor that I really liked. And we sat there, many hours into the night laughing over this. So
this was in Canada, I take it, this scouting camp?
No, actually, it was in Australia. It's a complicated story.
We like complicated stories.
Well, first, how did I get to Canada, I suppose? Because when I was a student at Sydney University, I remember sitting in the library. Instead of doing my essay, I was reading Student magazine, Student newspaper produced in Canada, and I thought, wow, I was impressed. I've got to see Canada. And so I came here and met a lot of people, and especially SUSC groups, student groups. And among those, I also met Roman, except at that time, it was just that.
You talk about the University Ukrainian Students newspaper, Student. What were your studies like? What did you major in, and what was your career path?
Well, I majored in linguistics at Sydney University and also took some Ukrainian courses at Macquarie University. After that, I moved to Canada. I worked as an interpreter and translator for a good decade.
Which languages?
Ukrainian and English, working with delegations that were coming out of Ukraine and also Canadian government delegations going to Ukraine. And this was in the 90s, starting in the 90s, so there was not so much knowledge of spoken English then from among officials coming to Canada. And this is just the very beginning of official bilateral relations.
I studied history. I did both a BA and MA in Central East European history at University of Toronto, minors in Russian and German. I came to Ottawa as a historical researcher for the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals, the Deschênes Commission, 85-86. Our colleague said she would be writing the Foreign Service exam and whether I'd be interested. And I said, I'm not so sure. She said, oh, come on, write it. And I went, okay. So I wrote it, did okay, got invited to an interview, and ultimately joined the then Department of External Affairs, now Global Affairs Canada.
Okay, the Deschênes Commission, what role did you play as a historian?
Providing historical context for researchers, investigators, and others, like what was going on in this large chunk of Central and Eastern Europe during World War II. It's one of these situations where you'd think that being an MA in history with minors in Russian and German would be the surest path to unemployment, but it happened to be exactly what that particular Commission of Inquiry wanted.
We met just at that point when he had finished working for the Deschênes Commission. At that time, he'd applied for Foreign Affairs Canada and was still waiting to see what would happen.
Can you run me through your postings before Ukraine, because I do want to get to Ukraine?
Moscow 88 to 91. Kyiv 94 to 98, Berlin 2002, 2007, Belgrade 2011, 2014, then arriving in Kyiv for a second time, or third time, depending how you count it, in October of 2014.
I take it you were at a lower level in the Foreign Service in Moscow. Was that difficult as someone who grew up in a Ukrainian community? Was there any kind of pushback?
Yes and yes. Was it complicated given my own background? Yes, it required taking a step back and looking with a bit of critical distance at what I may have been led to believe about life and comparing it with Soviet reality as I encountered it. It's hopefully developed a slightly realist take on the Ukrainian situation, which I've tried to deploy ever since. In other words, you need to know your past, but you don't need to be a prisoner of your heritage.
How big of a factor is the Ukrainian community in Canada, the diaspora, in what a diplomat in Ukraine deals with on a daily basis? Is it a tripartite conversation? Can you just let me in on that?
The Ukrainian community is very present in the Canada-Ukraine bilateral relationship, more so than is the case with many other Canadian diplomatic relationships. It's because the community here is organized and able to engage in advocacy, but also has capacity. It's got academic institutions, it's got community organizations, it's got cultural groups, etc. And what's helpful also is that it has a leadership that knows how to operate, knows how to be interoperable with government. It is able to be nuanced, it is able to listen to what's going on in Ukraine, absorb, and incorporate that into its thinking.
Which presidencies were you present for as Canada's key representative in Kyiv?
The Poroshenko presidency, because I arrived a few months after he was inaugurated. I arrived in October. He was inaugurated in May. And then the end of that presidency, the transition to President Zelensky, who came in, of course, in May, June of this year, 2019.
Was Ukraine a dangerous place when you arrived? Did you feel at all, because I know for journalists it may not be the easiest place in which to work. Can you just give me a sense of living there, arriving from your previous post?
Our previous posting was in Belgrade, and we actually arrived directly. I think it was just one day of travel. When we arrived, it was October of 2015. No one was certain what would happen on the political scene in the next while, or on the security scene, what would happen to Ukraine. Would there be terrorist threats? Would we have gas and electricity during that winter that was coming? I think those were thoughts in my mind. But I never felt that it was unsafe. That people, just ordinary Kyivites, were kind of primed, were ready to react to the threat to their country. I found that in a way that was reassuring.
It's quite a different country than it was 5 years ago. I think, as Oksana was saying, in October 2014, it was a country kind of on the brink, both in security and economic terms. The economy was contracting by 12% annually. We were into 50-60% inflation. The currency was crumbling. Now the debate in Ukraine is 3.5% growth good enough? How about 5% growth? Foreign investment is beginning to come back in. Ukraine has an army that is recognizably more competent than it was before. It has a partially revamped police force, and there are Canadians very much engaged in helping that, similarly on the military side. So I think one of the saddest things would have been to sit around feeling powerless as things were being done to Ukraine. What I think Canada has done, both as at the national level through government action, but also through community action, is to empower Ukraine, to give it the tools to both defend itself and to develop itself.
Is it just time to leave, or did the clock run out? Why are you leaving?
Well, we left after 5 years of a 3-year posting. So a standard posting was 3 years. It was extended for another 2, which we appreciated very much, and both our department and our minister were in favor of that. And a diplomat needs to keep moving. One of the things that happens when you've been in a place for a long time is you begin naturally to empathize with your environment more than with the people who sent you. I think 5 years was a long enough time for us to achieve much of what we had in mind in terms of what we wanted to do. And now it's time to find new forms of keeping engaged.
Where are they sending him?
That's a good question. I think...
But they don't pull the plug on one posting and not tell you. What can you tell me?
Well, I think what is coming is that my husband Roman will finish up his job with Global Affairs Canada and then look for other opportunities.
Your husband says he isn't much of a dancer, but he's done pretty well for himself.
Oh, I disagree. I think he's a good dancer. He just doesn't want to admit it. It's one of those things you have to train yourself a bit, possibly a project for the next while. It's been an amazing path.
You're very kind to have met with me. Thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate this.
Ей, скобе, мій друже, дорогу вкажи, де скеля тризуб гордо в небо стримить, боронить від ока лихого й біди, ту квітку лілею, що мушу знайти. Ей, скобе, мій друже, дорогу вкажи, де скеля тризуб гордо в небо стримить, боронить від ока лихого й біди, ту квітку лілею, що мушу знайти.
Earlier in the show, you heard Sofia Rotaru singing Odna Kalina. A kalina is a Gelder rose. The leaf is similar to that of a maple. The Kubasonics played Mountain Groove. And you're listening to the Plost scouting song, Skob. That's Plost's motto. Skob. Silno, krasno, oberezhno, bistro. Stay strong, beautiful, prudent, and swift. And the performers are called Vinta. Partial funding for Nasha Kasha comes from the Shuchanko Foundation. I'm your reporter, Stefan Andrusiak. Back in a week, God willing. До милої зустрічі за тиждень часу, дорогі слухачі.
Мій друже, дорогу вкажи, де скеля тризуб гордо в небо стримить, боронить від ока лихого й біди, ту квітку лілею, що мушу знайти, ту квітку лілею, що мушу знайти, ту квітку лілею, що мушу знайти.